Many men, even those who have spent years or even decades in intimate relationships, still carry a major blind spot about what their partner is truly experiencing in the most intimate moments they share. It is not usually a lack of care. In fact, most men deeply care about their partner's experience. The issue is that no one has ever clearly and clinically explained what is actually happening in a woman's body and mind during intimacy, especially around penetration and what follows. Over time, this creates a quiet gap between perception and reality, small mismatches in timing, attention, and presence that slowly shape the quality of connection. In this message, I want to close that gap and bring clarity. I will guide you through what your partner's body and mind are really doing during intimacy, including physiological and emotional processes. To understand what a woman experiences during penetration, it is important to first look at the state her body must reach for that experience to unfold in a healthy and pleasurable way. Penetration feels completely different when the body is fully aroused compared to when arousal is incomplete or rushed, and the difference is not minor, but significant. This arousal process follows a specific biological sequence that begins in the brain and is regulated by the nervous system. When stimulation is perceived emotionally, mentally, or physically, the parasympathetic nervous system activates and directs increased blood flow toward the pelvic region. This vascular response becomes the foundation for all subsequent physical changes in the body. As blood flow increases, the clitoral structures become engorged, heightening sensitivity across the entire region. As arousal deepens, the vestibular bulbs swell and the vaginal entrance becomes more sensitive and responsive. The vaginal walls also produce lubrication through a process where fluid is drawn through the tissues due to increased blood flow. At the same time, the upper vaginal canal lengthens in a process often called tenting, and the cervix lifts upward as the uterus shifts slightly. This creates more internal space and reduces the likelihood of discomfort from deep contact with the cervix. Meanwhile, pelvic floor muscles gradually relax, allowing the opening to soften and making penetration feel more natural and welcomed. This relaxation is strongly dependent on psychological safety, trust, and adequate time, and it cannot be forced or rushed without affecting comfort and overall experience. Her body has not yet reached the internal threshold that signals readiness for full openness. This is why emotional safety is not a soft or optional part of intimacy, but a biological requirement. The entire arousal sequence unfolds gradually and cannot be compressed without altering the experience. In most women, reaching full arousal, meaning sufficient blood flow, natural lubrication, vaginal expansion, and pelvic floor relaxation, often takes roughly 15 to 45 minutes of appropriate responsive stimulation. With increasing age, particularly after menopause, hormonal changes can slow and deepen this process, making more time and consistent lubrication support necessary, regardless of desire. When penetration is attempted too early, each system is partially unprepared. Sensitivity is reduced, internal expansion is incomplete, and muscular resistance remains. For men, especially older men who feel time pressure around performance, this is where rushing becomes counterproductive, reducing comfort and pleasure rather than enhancing connection. During penetration in a fully aroused state, the experience is shaped by a dense network of neurological and vascular responses that are already fully activated. The entrance of the vaginal canal contains a high concentration of nerve endings, and once tissues are fully engorged from arousal, those nerves respond with far greater intensity. The expanded vestibular structures gently compress against surrounding tissue, meaning that internal movement also stimulates deeper layers of the clitoral system indirectly. This produces a multi-layered sensation that feels more internal and whole body than sharp or surface-focused. Many women describe it as a sense of fullness that feels both physical and perceptual, as if attention naturally shifts inward and settles. This grounded quality is distinct from external stimulation, integrating pressure, warmth, and movement into a unified sensory experience that feels stable rather than fragmented. On a neurochemical level, penetration during a safe, consensual, and emotionally connected encounter can trigger a surge of oxytocin, a hormone strongly linked with bonding, trust, and emotional closeness. This release is not symbolic but physiological, contributing to a sense of being emotionally held and deeply connected in the moment. The intensity of this response is strongly influenced by the relational environment. When a woman feels safe, respected, and genuinely desired, the oxytocin response is amplified, deepening both physical sensation and emotional meaning. Conversely, emotional distance, distraction, or pressure can significantly dampen this neurochemical effect, even if the physical act remains the same. This means that presence, attention, and emotional attunement are not separate from physical intimacy. They actively shape the brain and body's response, determining whether the experience feels deeply fulfilling or merely mechanical. The trust layer of intimacy is something many men are never explicitly guided to notice, yet it sits at the center of how penetration is experienced by her. From her point of view, allowing someone into her body involves a form of vulnerability that has no real equivalent in male experience. It requires the nervous system to shift out of its protective, guarded state and into openness, which only happens when safety, respect, and emotional attunement are clearly registered. The pelvic floor is not something that simply complies. It releases when the body feels secure rather than evaluated or rushed. As women move into later stages of life, especially after 50, there is often a heightened awareness of body changes and how they are perceived. In that space, the sense of being genuinely desired as she is now becomes directly tied to how safe her system feels to fully open and remain receptive. The practical side of this understanding comes down to three interconnected elements: pace, attention, and presence. She needs the beginning of penetration to unfold slowly, not as uncertainty, but as respect for how the body transitions into internal accommodation. A gradual start allows the internal tissues and pelvic muscles to adjust instead of reacting with subtle tightening. Once penetration begins, her breathing becomes one of the most reliable signals you can follow. A steady, deep rhythm usually reflects comfort and increasing arousal, while breath holding, shallowness, or tension often signals the need to slow down and allow the body to settle again. Just as important is emotional presence, because her nervous system is continuously registering whether she is being met with patience or urgency. When you stay attentive instead of rushed, the experience becomes more coherent, allowing pleasure and connection to develop naturally rather than being interrupted by pressure or speed. Her muscular responses through the pelvic floor, abdomen, and thighs carry clear information about how her body is receiving the experience. When she moves toward you, reaches for you, or naturally synchronizes with your rhythm, it usually reflects comfort, openness, and increasing pleasure. When she becomes still, holds her breath, or subtly withdraws, it often signals that something needs adjustment, whether that is pace, depth, angle, or simply more time. This feedback is not complex, but it depends entirely on where your attention is directed. If your focus is inward, on performance, adequacy, or self-monitoring, you lose access to this information. When attention is outward, directed toward her breathing, movement, and relaxation, you begin receiving continuous guidance from her body. With experience and reduced performance pressure, especially later in life, many men actually become better able to sustain this outward attention, which improves responsiveness and connection. During the approach to orgasm, consistency becomes critical. Her nervous system locks into the pattern that is working, and sudden changes in rhythm, pressure, or angle can interrupt that buildup. When she signals that she is close, the most supportive response is often not to do more, but to maintain exactly what is already effective without introducing variation. At the same time, the experience does not end at physical release. The post-intimacy phase is emotionally and neurochemically significant, as oxytocin and other bonding-related states remain elevated. How you behave in those moments, whether you remain present, warm, and connected, or quickly disengage, shapes how safe and valued she feels in the experience. Consistent presence afterward reinforces trust, while withdrawal can create emotional distance over time, even if everything else went well. When all of this is brought together, intimacy becomes less about isolated physical actions and more about a coordinated system of awareness, timing, and emotional attunement. Her body is not responding to penetration alone, but to the entire environment surrounding it: safety, patience, attention, and consistency. Full arousal requires time and a sequence of physiological changes that cannot be rushed without altering the experience. Penetration, when it happens within that readiness, becomes a deeply integrated physical and emotional event rather than a mechanical one. For you, the central shift is learning to stay present with her signals instead of your own internal performance narrative, allowing her responses to guide pacing and adjustment. In that state of attentiveness, the experience becomes more synchronized, more responsive, and ultimately more connected for both partners. Emotional presence is not something extra or optional in this context. It functions as a real biological requirement for the fullness of her experience. She needs a rhythm that is patient, attention that is genuinely directed toward her responses, and consistency when the moment calls for it. Just as importantly, she needs your awareness to remain with her even after the physical act has ended, because the neurochemical and emotional state created through intimacy does not shut off instantly. When a man understands this, he is no longer going through steps or applying techniques in a mechanical way. He is actually present with another person in one of the most sensitive and neurologically active human experiences. His focus is not on assumptions or performance narratives, but on her lived reality in real time, which allows a deeper kind of connection to form that many long-term couples never fully reach. The integrated understanding I have described reflects what mature, emotionally grounded intimacy can look like later in life. It is not about physical intensity or complex technique, but about awareness, emotional steadiness, and the ability to stay attuned to a partner's experience without distraction or urgency. This level of presence allows a woman to feel safe enough to be fully open and fully herself, which in turn creates a deeper and more sustaining form of closeness for both people. That kind of connection is available to any man willing to develop the patience and attentiveness it requires, and it is often what transforms intimacy from something routine into something genuinely meaningful and lasting. What I'm really describing here is not just better intimacy, but a shift in how attention, safety, and nervous system regulation interact during close physical connection. In long-term relationships, especially later in life, intimacy becomes less about novelty and more about precision of awareness. The body responds less to intensity and more to cues of safety, pacing, and emotional steadiness. That means the quality of presence between two people starts to matter more than any specific technique. When someone is fully attuned to their partner's signals, breathing, movement, tension, ease, they are effectively participating in a feedback loop where the nervous system is continuously adjusting based on felt safety. From a physiological perspective, arousal is tightly linked to autonomic nervous system balance. When the parasympathetic system is dominant, the body is more able to relax, receive, and respond. When sympathetic activation rises, stress, urgency, performance pressure, the body shifts toward protection. That shift doesn't require conscious fear. Even subtle internal pressure, like doing it right, can be enough to disrupt that balance. This is why emotional presence matters so much. It is one of the main conditions that allows the body to stay in a receptive state rather than a guarded one. There is also a relational dimension that often gets overlooked. Intimacy is not experienced as a purely physical event, but as a moment of being perceived by another person. That means she is not only responding to touch, but to what she senses in you while being touched. Your attention, your patience, your steadiness. If your awareness is fragmented or self-directed, the experience becomes similarly fragmented for her. If your attention is stable and outward-facing, her nervous system tends to mirror that stability, which deepens comfort and responsiveness over time. In longer relationships, this becomes even more important because familiarity does not automatically produce connection. In fact, familiarity can sometimes reduce attentiveness if both partners start relying on assumption instead of observation. The most meaningful intimacy later in life often comes from the opposite direction, not doing more, but noticing more. Small adjustments in pace, responsiveness, and emotional tone can have a larger impact than physical variation, because they directly influence whether the body remains in a receptive state or shifts into subtle protection. Another important layer is the post-intimacy state, which is often underestimated. After closeness, the nervous system remains in a chemically sensitive window where bonding and emotional memory are being consolidated. This is not just about affection, it is about how the brain encodes the experience as either safe, connecting, or incomplete. When there is warmth, presence, and continuity afterward, the experience tends to be integrated as emotionally satisfying. When there is sudden withdrawal or disconnection, the body can register that contrast quite strongly, even if the physical experience itself was positive. Over time, these repeated patterns shape the overall emotional architecture of a relationship. It is not any single encounter that defines intimacy, but the accumulation of whether someone consistently feels met, noticed, and emotionally held. That is why presence has such a long-term effect. It is not just influencing a moment, it is shaping how safe the entire relational space feels for openness to continue developing. One of the deeper things to understand is that intimacy is essentially a co-regulated nervous system event. In simple terms, both partners are influencing each other's internal state in real time, even without words. When one person is calm, present, and attentive, it becomes easier for the other person's body to downshift into relaxation. When one person is tense, distracted, or internally performing, that tension is often picked up and mirrored, even subtly. This is why emotional state is not separate from physical experience. They are constantly feeding into each other. What often gets missed is that the body does not respond to intention alone. It responds to signals it can read moment by moment. Those signals are not just touch-based. They include timing, pauses, stillness, responsiveness, and even micro-adjustments in pressure or rhythm. A present partner is essentially in a continuous state of listening, not just doing. That listening allows the experience to evolve organically rather than being forced into a predefined script. When that happens, the encounter becomes less about control and more about responsiveness, which is where depth of connection tends to emerge. There is also an important psychological shift that happens when a man moves from performance orientation to attunement orientation. Performance orientation is internally focused. Am I doing this right? Is this enough? How am I being perceived? Attunement orientation is externally focused. What is happening for her right now? How is her body responding? What is changing in her breathing or tension? The first creates self-monitoring, which fragments attention. The second creates presence, which stabilizes attention. And attention is one of the most powerful regulators of relational experience. Over time, couples often discover that the most meaningful change is not technical improvement, but the reduction of mental noise. When there is less internal commentary and more direct perception, both partners feel more seen in a literal nervous system sense. That feeling of being accurately perceived, without rush, without agenda, is one of the strongest contributors to emotional safety in long-term intimacy. And as relationships mature, this becomes even more central. The nervous system becomes less interested in novelty and more responsive to predictability of safety. That does not mean repetition or boredom. It means trust in the pattern of how someone will treat your experience. When that trust is strong, the body relaxes faster, opens more easily, and sustains connection for longer periods without strain. In that sense, the real skill being described is not sexual technique at all, but sustained relational awareness under conditions of high emotional and physical sensitivity. Another layer that deepens this topic is understanding that intimacy is not a fixed state, but something that moves in waves. The body does not stay in one level of arousal or openness. It shifts continuously between expansion and slight contraction, depending on what it perceives in the moment. These shifts are often subtle, but they are meaningful. A moment of increased ease might open the system further, while a moment of distraction or tension might slightly close it again. This is why consistency of presence matters more than intensity, because the system is constantly updating. When both partners are in sync, these waves tend to align. One person's relaxation supports the other's, and small adjustments naturally guide the interaction back into balance when it drifts. But when attention is divided, those corrections are missed. The result is not usually obvious disruption, but a gradual reduction in depth and responsiveness. This is often why some experiences feel progressively more connected over time, while others feel like they plateau or flatten out without either partner fully understanding why. There is also a difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is automatic and often driven by internal urgency or assumption. Responding is slower and informed by observation. In intimacy, reacting might look like continuing a pattern because it was working a moment ago, even if something has changed. Responding means noticing that something has shifted, breathing, tension, movement, and adjusting accordingly. That small distinction is often what separates mechanical repetition from genuinely attuned connection. Over time, this kind of responsiveness builds a kind of trust that is not verbal but embodied. Her body begins to learn that it will be met where it is, not where it was expected to be. That reduces the need for protective tension and allows relaxation to happen more quickly and deeply. This is not something that can be forced. It develops through repeated experiences of being accurately met in real time. At a psychological level, this also changes how safety is experienced. Safety is not just the absence of harm or discomfort, but the presence of predictability in how another person will respond to you. When someone consistently notices and adjusts without judgment or delay, the nervous system stops scanning for misalignment. That reduction in scanning frees up energy for sensation, connection, and emotional openness. This is why the most advanced form of intimacy described in this framework is not about doing more, but about interfering less with what is already naturally unfolding. The less distortion introduced by performance pressure or internal distraction, the more clearly both partners can actually perceive each other. A further dimension that often goes unspoken is how memory and emotional association begin to shape intimacy over time. The nervous system does not treat each intimate experience as isolated. It builds a kind of emotional map based on repetition. If someone consistently feels rushed, unheard, or emotionally unattended, that pattern becomes stored as a subtle expectation. If they consistently feel met, paced with, and emotionally held, that becomes the default expectation instead. Over time, this shapes how quickly the body relaxes into openness before anything physical even begins. This is why intimacy in long-term relationships is deeply cumulative. It is not only about what happens in a single moment, but about what the body has learned to expect from a particular person. A partner who is consistently attentive becomes a kind of safety cue in themselves. Their presence alone can begin to signal relaxation, even before any physical interaction occurs. This is not psychological imagination in a vague sense. It is conditioned nervous system response built through repeated experience. Another important aspect is that emotional regulation is often shared in real time. When one partner becomes more grounded, the other often follows without conscious effort. When one partner becomes distracted or tense, that shift can also be transmitted. This is why the quality of attention is so influential. Attention is not passive observation. It is an active regulatory input into the interaction. Where attention goes, the nervous system tends to follow. In this context, presence is less about effort and more about removal of interference. Many of the barriers to depth are not lack of skill, but the addition of unnecessary internal activity, self-judgment, anticipation, comparison, or pressure to achieve a certain outcome. When those layers quiet down, perception becomes clearer, and clearer perception leads to more accurate responsiveness, which in turn creates a more stable sense of connection. There is also a shift that happens when intimacy is no longer treated as something to perform correctly, but as something to continuously perceive. In performance mode, the mind is always slightly ahead or behind the present moment. In perception mode, attention stays anchored in what is actually happening now. That shift alone changes the quality of timing, responsiveness, and emotional tone because actions become based on real-time information rather than expectation. Over time, couples who develop this kind of attunement often describe a sense of ease that replaces effort, not because intimacy becomes simple in a superficial sense, but because less energy is spent correcting misunderstandings in real time. The interaction becomes more fluid, more responsive, and less disrupted by misalignment between intention and experience. When you put all of this together, the central idea becomes surprisingly simple, even though the systems behind it are complex. Intimacy is not primarily a sequence of physical actions. It is a continuously updating exchange of signals between two nervous systems, where each person is constantly shaping the other's sense of safety, openness, and responsiveness. The body is never just doing something in isolation. It is reacting to an environment that includes touch, timing, emotional tone, attention, and perceived presence. When those elements align, the system moves toward relaxation and receptivity. When they are misaligned, the system shifts toward protection, even if only subtly. What this means in practical terms is that the quality of connection is determined far more by awareness than by effort. Effort tends to be associated with doing more, trying harder, or improving technique. Awareness is different. It is the ability to accurately perceive what is happening in real time without being pulled away by internal commentary or performance pressure. In intimacy, awareness becomes the foundation for everything else. Without it, even good intentions can miss what is actually needed in the moment. With it, even small adjustments can have a large impact on how safe and connected the experience feels. Over time, the difference between mechanical intimacy and deeply connected intimacy is not found in novelty, intensity, or variety. It is found in whether both partners feel continuously met where they actually are, moment by moment. That being met experience is what allows the nervous system to stop bracing, stop anticipating, and start fully participating. When that happens, physical sensation and emotional connection are no longer separate tracks. They become part of the same unfolding process. This is what creates the sense of depth that people often struggle to describe, but clearly recognize when they experience it. In long-term relationships, especially later in life, this becomes even more significant. The body becomes less responsive to rushed stimulation and more responsive to safety, consistency, and emotional steadiness. That does not reduce intimacy, it refines it. It shifts the focus away from performance and toward presence. And presence, when it is stable and sustained, becomes the primary condition that allows both partners to feel fully seen and fully received. Ultimately, what this framework is pointing toward is not a set of techniques, but a way of being with another person, a way of staying present without splitting attention, a way of observing without controlling, a way of responding without rushing. When that becomes the default mode, intimacy stops being something you are trying to get right and becomes something you are participating in with clarity and mutual awareness. And in that state, the experience is no longer defined by effort or uncertainty. It is defined by alignment between bodies, between attention, and between two people who are both fully engaged in the same moment without leaving it.